Picture this. You are watching a NASCAR race on a Sunday afternoon. Engines roaring, cars pushing 200 miles per hour, 43 of the most skilled drivers in the world trading paint at speeds the human mind can barely process. Millions of fans are watching. It is supposed to be just another race. And then, in a single fraction of a second, everything changes. A car loses control. Metal meets concrete. The crowd goes silent. The commentators lose their words. And somewhere in that crumpled wreckage, a husband, a son, a father, a man who woke up that morning believing today was going to be his day, is gone. Just like that. Now here is the question that haunts every single one of these tragedies. Did it have to happen? Was there a rule that could have saved him? Was there a piece of equipment that could have made the difference? In too many cases, the heartbreaking answer is yes. But here is what separates the 4 stories you are about to hear from every other racing tragedy in history. These 4 men did not just lose their lives on a racetrack. Their deaths forced NASCAR to look itself in the mirror and make fundamental changes that are still saving lives today. Changes written in grief, paid for with the ultimate price. These are the NASCAR deaths that changed the rules forever. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into the 4 cases, you need to understand something about NASCAR. Racing has always been dangerous. The men and women who strap themselves into those cars every weekend know the risks. They have always known. But for decades, NASCAR operated with a mentality common across all of motorsport. An acceptance that crashes happen, injuries happen, and sometimes, tragically, death happens. Safety improvements came slowly, often only after public pressure forced the organization's hand. Drivers themselves were sometimes resistant to change, viewing safety equipment as an inconvenience, or worse, as an insult to their toughness. But there is a moment in every organization's history where that mentality is no longer sustainable, where the evidence becomes so overwhelming that change becomes not just desirable but absolutely necessary. In NASCAR's history, those moments came 4 specific times. And in each instance, a driver paid with his life so the sport could be made safer for every driver who came after him. The first story takes us to Atlanta in 1989 and a man named Grant Adcox who was on the verge of breaking through to NASCAR's biggest stage. The second takes us to the spring of 2000 and a young man who carried the most famous name in all of stock car racing. The third returns to that same year, the same track, the same devastating crash, asking the horrifying question of how the same thing could possibly happen twice in the same place in the same summer. And the fourth takes us to February 2001 and the most famous crash in the history of American motorsport. 4 deaths. 4 rule changes. 1 sport that is fundamentally different today because of what these men endured. Case 1. Grant Adcox, the man who was almost there. Grant Adcox was born on January 2, 1950, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He grew up in the American South during a time when stock car racing was not just a sport but a way of life. From the time he was a young man, it was clear he had a genuine gift behind the wheel. His specialty was superspeedway racing. At tracks like Daytona and Talladega, where speeds regularly exceeded 200 miles per hour, Grant Adcox was something special. He earned the nickname King of the ARCA Superspeedways, and that title was not given casually. He won 8 superspeedway races in the ARCA series alone. In 1986, he won 4 consecutive superspeedway events including the prestigious ARCA 200 at Daytona International Speedway. Even Dale Earnhardt, the most feared and respected driver of that era, acknowledged Adcox's talent. When the intimidator says you can drive, you can drive. By the late 1980s, Adcox had 60 starts in NASCAR's Winston Cup Series, coming the hard way in underfunded family-owned equipment without the backing of major manufacturers. He was getting results that turned heads despite having half the resources of his competitors. The right opportunity was finally on the horizon. He was 39 years old, experienced, talented, and ready. He had one more race on the 1989 calendar. The Atlanta Journal 500 at Atlanta International Raceway on November 19, 1989, was the final race of the Winston Cup season. Atlanta was a formidable 1.522-mile oval known for its high speeds and challenging surface. Race speeds regularly exceeded 170 miles per hour. It was not a track that forgave mistakes. Adcox had prepared professionally. The car was ready. For 201 laps, everything was going to plan. He was running competitively, managing his equipment, staying out of trouble the way experienced racers do. Then came lap 202. Entering turn 2, his car made contact with the outside wall with tremendous force. The impact was violent and immediate. The car did not stop. It slid back across the racing surface and struck the inside wall as well. The car caught fire. Safety crews responded immediately, but the extrication was not simple. The damage was so severe that crews had to cut the roof off the vehicle to reach Adcox inside. He was airlifted to Georgia Baptist Hospital in Atlanta. He was pronounced dead at 4:15 in the afternoon. He was 39 years old. He was on the verge of everything he had worked his whole career toward. And he was gone. In the aftermath, NASCAR investigators examined the wreckage carefully. What they found was deeply troubling. Not because it revealed some catastrophic, unforeseeable failure. What they found was troubling precisely because it was something utterly mundane in its nature but devastating in its consequences. The racing seat inside Adcox's car had failed. The seat mounting hardware, the bolts and brackets that were supposed to hold the seat firmly in place and transfer crash energy into the car's structure, had not done their job. Under the extreme forces of the crash, the seat had torn completely away from its mountings. Think about what that means. A racing seat is not just a place to sit. It is the driver's last line of physical defense. When a car hits a wall at 170 miles per hour, the entire engineering philosophy behind a race car is designed to manage and redirect that energy, to crumple the car in controlled ways, to absorb the forces before they reach the driver. The seat keeps the driver positioned correctly relative to the roll cage and the safety harness. When the seat fails, the driver becomes a free object inside a crashing vehicle. The forces that were supposed to be managed instead act directly on flesh and bone. This was not fate. This was not unavoidable. This was a failure of preparation, a failure of inspection, a failure of standards that should have governed how every race car in NASCAR's top series was built and checked before it was allowed on the racetrack. For the 1990 season, NASCAR introduced mandatory seat mounting regulations. The new rules established specific, non-negotiable requirements for how seats had to be installed. They defined the hardware required. They created inspection protocols that would verify compliance before any car was allowed to compete. Teams could no longer make their own decisions about how to secure the seat. Those decisions were now in the rulebook, enforced by officials with authority to send a car home if it did not meet the standard. This sounds simple. It sounds obvious. It sounds like something that should have existed from the beginning. And that is exactly the point. Grant Adcox never got to see the breakthrough season he had worked his whole career to reach. But every driver who has sat in a properly mounted seat in a NASCAR race car since 1990 owes him something, whether they know his name or not. Rest in peace, Grant Adcox. January 2, 1950 to November 19, 1989. Adam Petty, the fourth generation. There are certain names in American sports that carry weight beyond statistics, beyond championships. In NASCAR, there is no name that carries more of that weight than Petty. Lee Petty won 3 championships and 54 races. His son Richard Petty won 7 championships and 200 races, the most in the history of the sport, earning the title simply of the King. Richard's son Kyle carried the name into the modern era. And then there was Adam. Adam Kyle Petty was born on July 10, 1980, in High Point, North Carolina. He was the 4th generation of the most famous family in the history of American motorsport, and sports historians noted he was the first 4th-generation athlete in any major American sport. But here is what you need to understand. The historic circumstances of his birth were almost beside the point. He had genuine talent, real and measurable, that existed independently of the family name. People in the NASCAR garage did not look at Adam Petty and see a legacy. They looked at him and saw a driver. In 1998, Adam Petty won his first ARCA race, becoming the first 4th-generation winner in motorsports history. He was 17 years old. By the spring of 2000, he was 19 and competing in NASCAR's Busch Series. On April 2, 2000, he made his Cup debut at Texas Motor Speedway, becoming the first 4th-generation competitor in NASCAR's Premier Series. The trajectory was clear. The future was bright. On May 12, 2000, that future ended at New Hampshire Motor Speedway. New Hampshire Motor Speedway in Loudon is a 1-mile oval, modest by the standards of Daytona and Talladega. Nobody would call it a particularly dangerous track. On May 12, the Busch Series was there for a practice day before the Busch 200. Practice sessions are where drivers fine-tune the setup, get a feel for the track, work through mechanical issues. They are supposed to be the less dangerous part of a race weekend. Adam Petty was in his number 45 Chevrolet, doing exactly what he was supposed to do, running laps, gathering data, preparing for the race. Then, entering turn 3, the throttle stuck. A race car with a stuck open throttle is a machine with no way to slow down. No way to manage its speed. No way to navigate the track safely. The car goes wherever it goes at whatever speed it is going, and the driver can only steer and hope and pray that somehow the impact, when it comes, is survivable. At turn 3 of New Hampshire Motor Speedway, with the throttle wide open and no way to reduce his speed, Adam Petty's Chevrolet hit the outside concrete wall with tremendous force. The impact was nearly head-on. Emergency crews responded immediately. Extrication took approximately 20 minutes. Adam Petty was pronounced dead. Basilar skull fracture. He was 19 years old. The racing world stopped. Richard Petty, the king, the man who had seen everything in 60 years of NASCAR, was broken. Kyle Petty was shattered in a way that no parent should ever be. And across the entire sport, the weight of what had happened settled in with a terrible heavy finality. In the investigation that followed, NASCAR found that the throttle malfunction was not an isolated anomaly. It was a problem that existed across all 3 national series. The specific mechanical configuration of the throttle linkage created conditions under which it could, under certain circumstances, become stuck in the open position. Not frequently, but it could happen. There was another issue the investigators confronted, one that in hindsight appears almost unbearably tragic. Basilar skull fracture, the injury that killed Adam Petty, is caused by the rapid deceleration of a crash and the resulting violent movement of the head relative to the body. In that fraction of a second when a car hits a wall at racing speed, the forces cause the skull to move at a different rate than the spine, and the resulting stress fractures the base of the skull in a way that is almost invariably fatal. In the year 2000, a device existed that was specifically designed to prevent this type of injury. The HANS device, which stands for Head and Neck Support, had been developed in the 1980s. It was a collar worn around the driver's neck and shoulders that attached to the helmet and prevented the violent forward movement of the head during a crash. It dramatically reduced the forces acting on the base of the skull. The HANS device was available in 2000. It was legal under NASCAR rules. Ford Motor Company and General Motors were so convinced of its effectiveness that they were actively offering to pay for HANS devices for any of their contract drivers who wanted one. $1,200 per driver. Most drivers were not using it. Dale Earnhardt, the most prominent driver in the sport, famously called the HANS device that damn noose and refused to wear it. When Earnhardt refused something, a lot of other drivers found it easier to refuse as well. These were tough men in a tough sport, and toughness was not just a characteristic. It was an identity. NASCAR implemented kill switch requirements after Adam Petty's death, a mandatory device on the steering wheel that could cut the engine if the throttle stuck. They reviewed throttle linkage configurations across all series. Important improvements. But they did not mandate the HANS device. They would have another chance to learn that lesson. They would not have to wait long. Rest in peace, Adam Petty. July 10, 1980 to May 12, 2000. Kenny Irwin Jr. The same corner, the same cause. Kenny Irwin Jr. was born on August 5, 1969, in Indianapolis, Indiana, the heartland of American motorsport. He began in open-wheel competition and showed the precision and sensitivity that marks the genuinely gifted. In 1996, he won the USAC National Midget Championship, one of the most prestigious titles in American racing. In 1997, he transitioned to NASCAR and was named the Craftsman Truck Series Rookie of the Year in his very first season in stock cars. The following year, 1998, he moved up to the Winston Cup Series. In his first year racing against Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt, and the greatest drivers of that generation, Kenny Irwin Jr. was named the Winston Cup Rookie of the Year. His car owner Robert Yates compared his raw talent directly to Jeff Gordon. In his very first year in NASCAR's top series, this kid from Indianapolis was recognized as the best new driver in the sport. By the summer of 2000, Irwin was driving the number 42 Chevrolet for Team Sabco. The season had been difficult, but everyone who understood racing talent believed his best years were ahead of him. On July 7, 2000, Kenny Irwin Jr. arrived at New Hampshire Motor Speedway for the New England 300 Cup weekend, the same track where Adam Petty had died 56 days earlier. Practice was underway. Drivers were working through their sessions, making setup adjustments, communicating with their crews. Standard procedure on a standard race weekend. Irwin was in turn 3, the same turn 3 where Adam Petty had died, when his throttle stuck. The same turn. The same track. The same mechanical failure. 56 days after Adam Petty. The car hit the outside wall. Then it flipped onto its side and onto its roof, tumbling along the track surface in a way that subjects the driver inside to forces far beyond what any human body is designed to absorb. Irwin Jr. was extracted by emergency crews who responded with everything they had. But the injury was the same injury that had killed Adam Petty 56 days before. In the same corner of the same track, basilar skull fracture. He was 30 years old. Tony Stewart, who had a fierce and celebrated rivalry with Irwin that had produced some of the most intensely competitive racing of the late 1990s, won the New England 300 that Sunday. After the race, he donated the winner's trophy to Kenny Irwin's parents. It was one of the most profoundly human gestures in the history of the sport. A champion acknowledging that the race, the win, the trophy, all of it meant nothing compared to the loss that had just occurred. Two drivers. The same track. The same corner. The same cause. The same fatal injury. 8 weeks apart. NASCAR officials did not announce Kenny Irwin's death for more than 4 hours after it occurred, feeding a growing perception that the organization was not handling the situation with the transparency the moment demanded. The throttle investigation conducted after Adam Petty's death had apparently not solved the problem. The changes that had been required had not prevented the same failure from occurring in the same place. And throughout all of this, the Hans device still sat in its box. Still not mandatory. Ford and General Motors still offering to pay for it. Most drivers still not using it. In the weeks and months that followed, 3 more deaths hammered the sport. Tony Roper died from a basilar skull fracture in the Craftsman Truck Series at Texas Motor Speedway on October 13, 2000. 3 drivers dead from the same preventable injury in a single year. 3 sets of families left to grieve over something that a $1,200 piece of equipment might have prevented. The pressure on NASCAR was reaching a breaking point. Internal discussions at NASCAR headquarters became urgent in a way they had never been before. The organization was being pushed toward mandating the Hans device, pushed by medical professionals, by safety engineers, by the undeniable weight of the evidence. Change was coming, but it came too late for one more driver. The sport's most famous driver, its biggest star. The man whose face was on the billboards and whose name was on the merchandise. The man who had called the Hans device a noose. Rest in peace, Kenny Irwin Jr. August 5, 1969 to July 7, 2000. Case 4, Dale Earnhardt, the day everything changed. There are sports figures whose fame transcends their sport entirely. In American stock car racing, in NASCAR, that figure was Dale Earnhardt. Ralph Dale Earnhardt was born on April 29, 1951, in Kannapolis, North Carolina, the son of a short-track racing driver who gave him something more valuable than a championship. He gave him a love of racing that was genuine, deep, and unconditional. Dale Earnhardt dropped out of school at 16 to pursue racing full-time. What he wanted from life was to race, to win, and to be the best. Over more than 20 years in the Winston Cup Series, he won 7 championships, equaling Richard Petty's record and never surpassed by anyone else. He won 76 races. He drove the black number 3 Chevrolet with a ferocity that made him the most recognizable figure in a sport full of recognizable figures. He earned the nickname the Intimidator for a driving style that combined genuine talent with an aggression that his competitors respected and feared equally. His merchandise outsold every other driver year after year. His relationship with his fans was one of the deepest in the history of American professional sports. He had survived more frightening crashes than almost any driver of his generation, and that track record had given him a confidence that bordered on belief in his own invulnerability. He was the most prominent opponent of the Hans device. He called it a noose. He refused to wear it. And in the culture of the NASCAR garage, when Dale Earnhardt refused something, his refusal carried enormous weight. On February 18, 2001, Dale Earnhardt arrived at Daytona International Speedway for his 20th attempt to win the Daytona 500. The race had eluded him for almost his entire career. When he finally won it in 1998, after 20 years of trying, he won it with such joy that even his fiercest rivals found themselves smiling. In 2001, he was back. He was 49 years old, still competitive, still dangerous, still the Intimidator. His son Dale Earnhardt Jr. was in the field, racing for his father's team. His longtime friend and teammate Michael Waltrip was also in the race, in a car Earnhardt owned. It was a family affair, a celebration of everything the Earnhardts had built in the sport. The 2001 Daytona 500 was a remarkable race. As the final lap began, Michael Waltrip was in the lead. Dale Earnhardt Jr. was in second. And Dale Earnhardt Sr. was in third, doing what he so often did, using his body and his car to block and protect and clear the path for his teammates. He was sacrificing his own chance at the win to make sure the cars he owned and the people he cared about got to victory lane. Then, on the final turn of the final lap, contact from Sterling Marlin sent Earnhardt's car sliding up the track. He made contact with Ken Schrader. The two cars hit the outside wall together. Earnhardt's car slid down the banking and came to rest in the infield grass. The crash did not look fatal to the millions of people watching on television. There was no fire, no dramatic flip, no explosion of debris that signaled the worst. It looked like the kind of crash that Dale Earnhardt had walked away from dozens of times. Commentators called it a hard crash. Viewers assumed he would climb out of the window, wave to the crowd, and walk back to the garage the way he always did. He did not climb out. The medical team arrived at the car within seconds. The seriousness of what had occurred became apparent to those on the scene immediately, but it took time for that information to reach the broadcast booth and then the grandstands and then the millions of people watching at home. Michael Waltrip crossed the finish line to win the Daytona 500, the greatest moment of his career, while emergency crews were working on his car owner in the infield. Dale Earnhardt was transported to Halifax Medical Center, approximately 2 miles from the speedway. He was 49 years old, 7-time champion, the most famous driver in the history of the sport. At 5:16 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, NASCAR President Mike Helton walked to a podium in front of cameras and microphones and said words that no one in the sport had ever expected to hear. "We have lost Dale Earnhardt." 17 million people had been watching the race live. The news spread across the country and then around the world within minutes. It was the sports story of the year, perhaps of the decade. A man whose name was synonymous with invincibility, whose identity was built around surviving the unsurvivable, was gone. Basilar skull fracture. The same injury that had killed Adam Petty. The same injury that had killed Kenny Irwin Jr. The same injury that had killed Tony Roper. The fourth driver to die from this specific, preventable injury in less than 9 months. And he had not been wearing the Hans device. The device that Ford and General Motors had been offering to pay for. The device that biomechanical researchers had been recommending for years. The device that Earnhardt himself had called a noose and refused to wear. The investigation that followed was thorough and unsparing. Researchers examined the crash data, the forces involved, the specific mechanics of the fatal injury. Their conclusion was direct. The Hans device, or a comparable head restraint system, would have dramatically reduced the forces on the base of Earnhardt's skull in that crash. It might not have guaranteed his survival, but it would have given him a significantly better chance. The racing world was not just grieving. It was confronting an impossible question. The most protected driver in the sport, the man with the best equipment and the most experienced team and decades of survival as evidence of his toughness, had died from an injury that existing technology could have prevented. If it could happen to Dale Earnhardt, it could happen to anyone. There was no level of talent or experience or reputation that made a driver immune to basilar skull fracture. NASCAR acted with a speed and decisiveness it had not previously shown on head restraints. In October 2001, the Hans device or an approved equivalent was made mandatory across all 3 national series. No exceptions. Every driver, in every car, at every race. The cultural resistance was overcome because the alternative was no longer acceptable. In 2002, NASCAR mandated safer barriers at all oval tracks. The safer barrier, steel and foam energy reduction, replaced hard concrete retaining walls with hollow steel tubes backed by energy-absorbing foam. When a car hits a safer barrier, it moves with the impact, absorbing and redirecting crash energy rather than bouncing it directly back into the car. The difference in forces experienced by the driver is enormous. In 2007, the driver's seating position was moved closer to the center of the car. New energy-absorbing door panels were required. Roll cage requirements were strengthened. In 2008, the car of tomorrow became the full-time Cup vehicle, a fundamental redesign built around driver safety as the primary engineering priority. The results speak for themselves. In the more than 20 years since Dale Earnhardt's death, NASCAR's top 3 national series have not recorded a single driver fatality. Not one. In a sport where multiple drivers were dying every year throughout the 1990s, that record represents one of the most significant safety transformations in the history of professional motorsport. Rest in peace, Dale Earnhardt. April 29, 1951 to February 18, 2001. For men. For different eras. For different tracks. For different failures that should have been caught and prevented. Grant Adcox showed NASCAR that informal standards were not enough, that every bolt and bracket needed to meet a written, inspected, enforced requirement. Adam Petty and Kenny Irwin Jr. showed together, in the most tragic way possible, that the same preventable failure happening twice in the same corner in the same summer was simply not acceptable. And Dale Earnhardt showed that no driver, no matter how famous or how tough, was beyond the reach of an injury that existing technology could have prevented. Each of these men paid the ultimate price. But their deaths were not in vain. The seat-mounting rules, the kill switches, the Hans device mandate, the safer barriers, every one of these changes was written in grief and paid for with the ultimate cost. Every one of them exists because a driver died and someone decided that the next driver did not have to. Today, drivers walk away from crashes that would have been fatal 30 years ago. They climb out of destroyed cars, wave to the crowd, and go home to their families. That is the legacy of Grant Adcox, Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin Jr., and Dale Earnhardt. They changed the rules. Forever. Please leave a like and subscribe to Torque Saga for more stories from the history of motorsport. Rest in peace to all four of these drivers.